2015 second reading debate.
Senator Waters.
Thanks very much, Acting Deputy President. And I rise with great pleasure to speak on my bill. Not for the first time, sadly, in the last 5 years. This is the third time that we Greens have introduced a bill to give landholders some rights against huge fossil fuel companies, whether they're multinational coal mining companies, whether they're multinational coal seam gas or unconventional gas fracking companies. It is about time that landholders actually had some rights to refuse damaging activities on their land, particularly on their productive farmland, which we know we have very little of in this arid nation. Now, of course, this bill also would ban the dangerous and risky process of fracking, an experiment with our land, with our geology, with our water, an experiment that we don't well understand, and indeed that's been banned in many other countries. So this bill would give landholders some rights to protect their land and their water and their communities and their health and, of course, the climate from the ravages of coal, coal seam gas, shale gas and tight gas, and it would ban the dangerous process of fracking. Now, this is not the first time we've had this debate. It was 2011 was the first time that I introduced this bill, the Landholders' Rights to Refuse Coal and Gas Bill, and sadly, 5 years on, we've seen very little progress in this chamber. What I am pleased about is that we have seen some progress in state jurisdictions. And I want to start by congratulating the Victorian State Labor Government for their ban on fracking, which they've just introduced legislation for in their parliament this week. Now, of course, they join many of their other Labor colleagues around the state, most of whom in opposition, have adopted similar policy positions to either ban fracking or to, at the very least, have a moratorium on it. So it seems that the tide is finally turning, and it's not a moment too soon, because we have communities right around this country that are being ravaged by this unfair balance of power between effectively David and Goliath battles with the gas and coal companies. And I'm from Queensland, of course, where we've been at the epicentre of this destructive industry, where communities in the Darling Downs, in the West, right throughout our state, have been the test bunnies for this dangerous industry. We've seen some of our best food-producing land turned into open-cut coal mines. We've seen some of our best food-producing land and some of our well-settled regional communities turned into fracking pads, where communities' health is worsening, where local GPs have been silenced by coal seam gas companies, and where the state government continues to turn a blind eye to the community impacts and to utterly ignore the risks to our groundwater and hence to our future food productivity. So it is an abominable situation in Queensland, and the one good thing that's come out of this is that other states have learned from our mistakes. And we've seen an amazing and inspirational community movement spring up, led by Lock the Gate Alliance, uniting many community members who feel that no one's listening to them, who feel that the National Party in this place, who used to claim to represent the bush but now just take the mining donations, and the two big parties again who take the generous donations from the fossil fuel companies, they have just been deaf to the calls of those regional communities saying, we don't want to be test bunnies, we don't want the health of our children risked, we don't want our water stuffed up so that we can't keep producing the food that you eat and that this nation exports. I don't actually know what it's going to take, Acting Deputy President, for those voices to finally be heard. We've been trying for 5 years to give voice to those concerns, to give those people a voice in this chamber. And sadly, every time this bill has come on for debate, I've received no support. The last time we brought this bill to a vote, we had the Labor, the Liberal and the National parties join to vote it down. They didn't want to give landholders the right to protect their land and their water and the climate and their health. They wanted to let the gas and mining companies rip because they keep taking those very generous donations. It seems that we've had some progress at the state level, but unfortunately it seems there's very little progress at this national level. I note the speaking list today. We Greens are speaking in favour of this bill. We have speakers from the Liberal Party and the Labor Party. There's no one else on the crossbench that is speaking up for residents against coal seam gas and unconventional gas. And I think people around the country would be very disappointed that this issue has been one that the Greens have basically been alone in championing the community's voice on. It's about time we had the representatives here in this parliament, both this House and the other, actually start to represent the people again and not just the vested interests that make very generous donations to their re-election campaigns. So, as I've said, this bill would use the constitutional abilities of this parliament to give landholders that right to refuse gas, exploration, fracking or massive coal mines eating up their land in some cases they've been on for generations and that they wish to pass on to their family. The bill would also ban fracking, and of course I've talked a little bit about why that is such a dangerous process, and I've mentioned that many other nations have actually banned it. It is a process whereby billions of litres of water and chemicals and a proppant, usually sand, are blasted down through wells which go through aquifers in order to get to either coal seams or shale or tight rock where gas is held, and those fracking fluids are blasted down at high pressure to create fractures in those seams or in that rock so that the gas can then be released and sucked back up. So this is effectively an experiment with our geology which pierces our aquifers on the way down. If you could think of a more dangerous process in the driest inhabited continent on the planet, then you're doing better than I can, because I cannot think of a riskier experiment to take with our most precious resource, which is of course fresh water. That's no wonder that Quebec, that Canada, that many other nations have banned this process. And of course it's why many of those state administrations, some in government, and I congratulate them, others in opposition, have said that they don't want to take the risk with our most precious resource. I would like to see federal Labor follow the lead of the Victorian state Labor government and finally actually endorse this bill after 5 years of opposing it. I commend their state colleagues, with the exception of Queensland, for the progress that they've made, and it's now time for some consistency. If the Victorian Andrews government can see that fracking is dangerous and he doesn't want it in his state, then surely the federal Labor opposition can look at that same evidence and ideally reach that same conclusion. I would urge them to do so. Now, as for the National Party, we know sadly that they've abandoned the bush and they now represent the big miners and the gas companies who make those generous donations, and we don't even have any Nationals in the chamber this time when we're talking about giving landholders rights to protect their land against coal seam gas and coal. Now, what an absolute tragic falling from grace that party has had on this issue, and they know it because people in the bush aren't voting for them anymore. So if they know what's good for them and if they actually care about land and water, then I would hope for their support on this bill. But sadly, usually they either don't show up or they leave before the vote. So it seems that that will happen again today. I've talked to you a little bit about Queensland, and I want to again express my disappointment that whilst some of the Labor oppositions or administrations around the country have listened to the community, it is a real crying shame that the Queensland Labor government has not. And in fact, they have enthusiastically opened up our state to even more fracking, right as the evidence is mounting that this is a dangerous practice we don't fully understand the health or the water consequences of. Labor continues to approve hundreds of new CSG wells across the Darling Downs, like at Wandoan, where they've just approved about 400 new wells on some of our best grain-growing country. Now, you cannot have coal seam gas well pads and the Swiss cheese effect of well pads, pipelines, roads, diesel generators, trucks in and out. You cannot have that coexist on food-producing land. And indeed, some of the farmers have recently invested in precision agriculture for irrigation techniques, and I commend them for that. The CSG well pads interfere with the GPS equipment on those pieces of equipment. So it is impossible for those farmers to continue to farm in a sustainable manner, to farm at all, when their farm is pockmarked with CSG wells, pipelines, diesel generators and people crawling over the land at all hours of the day and night. Now, a couple of years ago, the minister in Queensland, the Resources Minister, opened up 11,000 square kilometres of new land in Queensland to explore for shale gas, threatening the Great Artesian Basin and the Channel Country. Now, clearly, when you're talking about the Great Artesian Basin, this is not just a problem for Queensland, this is a problem for the nation's water supply, because we know that basin underpins much of our surface water supply. We also know that we've got job-rich alternatives that can supply energy and don't risk our land our water, our communities, their health, the climate, or the Great Barrier Reef, like coal seam gas and other unconventional gas does. The communities at Tara and Hopeland on the Darling Downs are still waiting for strategic air quality monitoring studies that were promised and then scrapped by the LNP government, and they haven't had a response and any action from the Queensland Labor government. Instead, we hear statements from the Labor Resources Minister in Queensland that gas is the fuel of the future. Well, I've got news for you. There's something that comes up every morning, goes down every night and doesn't cost a thing and doesn't make communities sick. That's where we should be investing our money, and the new exciting storage technologies for solar, whether they be molten salt, whether they be granite, whether they be batteries, can provide baseload clean power, which is job-rich and doesn't stuff up our other industries or the health of our communities. Now, in terms of the climate, we know that the fugitive emissions from coal seam gas make it basically as dirty as coal, and many of the studies that have been done on shale gas in the US prove this point. Australia's quite early on in the studies that it has done into this issue, which is kind of alarming because you'd think you'd do those studies before you let the industry rip. But no, they're now belatedly looking at a small slice of that, a good 10 years into the approvals that have flooded out from this government and from the Queensland State Government. And we've seen that the measurement that we use for fugitive emissions, which is the gas that leaks from those wells and pipes and in the course of the production and transport process for coal seam and other gas, other unconventional gas, we've seen that those fugitive emissions are estimated to be far lower than in fact they should be. And a recent report by the Australian Institute shows that Australia's guesstimate, because that's all it is, of the climate impacts of those fugitive emissions is in fact far less than other nations. So our emissions factor is far lower than it should be according to the science and according to the approach that many other nations take. Now, we've been waiting for 4 years now for the CSIRO research into fugitive emissions to properly study this. There's been one study that they've managed to complete so far, and they looked at 43 wells. Now, we have about 6,000 wells in Queensland, and of course there's between 20 and 40,000 wells slated. According to international gas markets, it's unclear how many of those will go ahead, and of course according to the strength of the community's opposition to those. So this single study looked at just 43 wells, and it didn't even look at all stages of production. It looked at some highly proscribed parts of the production process, and the study itself concluded, look, we've actually got to do more work before we can be confident in these conclusions. Don't extrapolate from this. So we're still looking and we're still waiting. Now, the GESERA, which is the geological body that's effectively a partnership between government and industry, because government underfunds it and so they need to go to industry for funding, have got some interesting work underway, but they've also got some coal and gas representatives that have effectively stacked their board. And when you have research budgets that have 5 industry reps, 3 CSIRO reps and 1 government rep, with the voting rights split 50-50 between industry and CSIRO as to who gets to decide on research, then again, I find it very unhelpful, and you can hardly call that an independent analysis. So I want to draw my remarks to a close because we have some other speakers that would like to speak on this bill, and I welcome that. This is great that we're getting some engagement. Let's hope that they speak in support of the bill, but I won't hold my breath. But I'd like to take the chance just to congratulate the local campaigners in a handful of areas that have been resisting the might of these big, well-funded, cashed-up, politically influential gas and mining companies. These little mob of communities around the country that have had the strength and the courage to band together and say, no way, you're not coming on here to wreck my land. I want to keep growing food for this country, and I want my kids to have that option, and I don't want you to poison our water. So I want to commend all of the campaigners in Victoria that has led to the state Victorian government banning fracking this week. And I want to shout out to the Northern Territory campaigners, many of whom are the traditional owners of the land. We've got 80% of the Northern Territory that's currently covered in oil and gas exploration licences. Now, much of that, of course, is Aboriginal land, and the campaign from those traditional owners, who've been joined with the graziers and other residents, has been absolutely inspirational. In the recent election, this was a key issue, and the new Labor administration was forced by the strength of that community voice and community opposition to gas and coal to adopt a strong position for a moratorium, which we intend to hold them to now that they're forming government. Unfortunately, the moratorium only applies to fracking during the production process, not the exploration process, and we know that our groundwater doesn't make a distinction between production and exploration, so we've still got a way to go. And of course there's a proposal that is still on foot for the Northern Territory gas pipeline, which will plough through into Queensland and send more of our gas offshore to export markets, increasing the gas squeeze domestically and increasing the pressure on communities to be opened up for this dangerous process. So I want to commend the Wakaya Aboriginal Land Trust for the resistance that they've shown and let them know that we stand with them and that we have seen these campaigns win around Australia, and together we can win this one as well. Now, in the short time that I've got left to me, I want to finish by commending the Queensland communities who faced the brunt of this industry from the outset with no support from government, with very little scientific information, because of course the government doesn't want us to know. If you don't look, then you can say, oh, we're not really sure about the dangers, let's just push on anyway. So much for the precautionary principle. So I want to pay tribute to Helen Bender and her family, who lost their father, George Bender, a man that I met on several occasions when he came and gave evidence at various Senate inquiries that I'd often instigated or participated in. And I want to pay tribute to their bravery and the emblematic struggle that they have, which represents the struggle that so many Queensland regional communities have had, whether they be at Tara, whether they be the North Drifts, who've stood up against the Queensland Gas Corporation and won and had fines for breaches of environmental conditions imposed. The health impacts on that family are devastating, and again they represent just one family of so many that are facing the brunt of the inconsideration of this industry, the carelessness and the profit motive once again just overriding communities. So it's time that we gave these communities the right to say no to this dangerous experiment on their land, and to stand up for their health, to stand up for our climate, and to stand up for food production and the sanctity of water supply, that most crucial resource. So it is with great pleasure that I speak to this bill again today, and I would urge again the larger political parties to not just do what your donors want you to do. Just because they give you money does not mean that the science is on their side. Please listen to the community and stand with them, protect their health, protect our land and our water and the climate from these dangerous fossil fuel industries, because we have clean alternatives that can generate jobs and generate clean energy, and they won't stuff up our agriculture or our reef or the health of our communities.
Thank you, Senator Watterson.